Here's a question for you. What happens when the population outstrips productivity? When there isn't enough food to go around? Well, we know what happens because it's happened before in various parts of the world. Paul Ehrlich, in his book The Population Bomb, wrote, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now." And a newsletter I received from the Environmental Fund quotes William Malloy, professor of anthropology at the University of Wyoming, who says the specter of overpopulation is once again threatening the people of the remote Pacific island, Easter Island. Back in the late 17th century, when the island's population outstripped its productivity, the devastation of war interrupted food production. The established religious aristocracy lost its essentially magical control, and the people degenerated into mutually hostile bands controlled by war leaders. The hitherto efficient economic equilibrium disintegrated. Crops were burned and farmers prevented from cultivating in safety. Cannibalism now became a practical activity, and people were hunted for food. Professor Malloy says what happens on Easter Island in the 17th century may be about to happen again. Since 1877, the island's population has been increasing at the annual rate of 5%. History will likely repeat itself, and anthropologists conclude the only difference being that this time, in line with Ehrlich's prediction, the fate of the Easter Islanders may be indistinguishably merged in a worldwide population explosion. Now, I don't go around the country preaching the possibility of disastrous effects of overpopulation. That's not my subject. But in talking to a group not long ago, I got on the subject and hit on what I thought was a pretty good illustration of what overpopulation can mean. I said the 200 of us in this room tonight are quite comfortable and at ease with one another. We've just enjoyed a good meal, now we're relaxed and comfortable. But let's say we started adding new people to the room. For a while, everything would be all right. But soon, it would begin to get crowded and less comfortable. Finally, if new people kept being added, the crowding would become intense and uncomfortable in the extreme. It would become intolerable, and you wouldn't be doing any kind of a favor for a person by forcing him into this room. When living becomes intolerable, it is perhaps better not to begin. I think we all have a graphic mental picture of what overcrowding, overpopulation can mean. I don't agree with Professor Malloy that the conditions on Easter Island will repeat what occurred back in the 17th century. I think the Chilean government, Easter Island belongs to Chile, will come to its rescue before that and augment the food supply, which brings about the ratchet effect. When populations are not controlled by their own natural supply and demand, that is, when the population does not slow down when food is scarce, which it would normally do because of artificial or outside injections of food and supplies, the population growth does not slow down. Like the paw on the ratchet, it holds so that there is no reversal, and then once again moves up from that point. The last time I was in Puerto Rico, a truly beautiful place, I was aware of the pressure of the population. There are people everywhere, and every one of them seems to have a car traveling at top speed. Well, according to this same newsletter, the birth rate in Puerto Rico is higher than that of the United States, but its death rate is lower, believe it or not. In fact, we're in 40th place in the death rate. In 1973, the birth rate in Puerto Rico was 24.1 per 1,000, and the death rate was just 6.7 per 1,000, compared with the U.S. average of 15.6 and 9.4, respectively. By next year, it's estimated that approximately 60% of Puerto Rico's population will be under age 25, of which one-third will be less than 13. So conditions in Puerto Rico, which is already more crowded than India or Japan, would not seem to be getting any better. Speaking of the death rate, I don't think you'd ever guess the countries with the lowest death rates. I wouldn't have come close. They're Taiwan and Singapore, with only 5 deaths per 1,000 of population. The United States death rate is 9.4 per 1,000 of population, and here's another surprise for you. Both Canada and Mexico beat the United States in the death rate, which is another way of saying their people are healthier than ours. Canada's is only 7.4, 2 full points better than the U.S. Mexico's is 9, and Mexico is one of the world's population problem countries. We were also beat out by such places as Singapore, Japan, Hong Kong, Fiji, Kuwait, Israel. Lebanon's is only 5, one of the best on earth. Angola in Central Africa is worse, a death rate of 30 per 1,000 of population. You might be faintly surprised to learn that places like the Bahamas also beat the United States, as does Guadeloupe, Jamaica, Martinique, Trinidad, and Tobago. The Netherlands Antilles is just 6, well below ours, and Cuba also reports a figure of 6 per 1,000. Almost makes you want to go live in the Caribbean, doesn't it? Beautiful climate, easygoing lifestyle, and very low death rate. Makes you think that maybe the death rate is affected by such things as climate and lifestyle, which it undoubtedly is. Cyprus beats us too, as do Russia, Yugoslavia, Spain, Greece, and Albania. New Zealand and Australia beat us too. But we beat Denmark, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. England has a death rate of 12, quite high. My old friend Gary Wyron could tell us all about our poor showing in the death rate statistics. My guess would be that our relatively high death rate, 9.4, isn't high. It's just higher than 40-some other countries. And I don't know why we can't lead in that important department, too. My guess would be that there are 2 culprits at work here. One is easy living, not enough exercise, and the other would be poor diet and overeating. Millions upon millions of young Americans have been raised on a diet of soft drinks and French fries, and they're certainly not going to help us improve in the death rate statistics. In fact, our rate will probably worsen. When you have young mothers who as teenagers lived on French fries and soft drinks, you can't expect them to educate their own children on good nutritional habits. Add to that the fact that we don't walk anymore, that we tend to soften to death, and develop physiques like polyethylene bags filled with chicken fat, and you can begin to understand why the richest country on earth is more than 40 places down the line when it comes to our mortality rate. I remember reading somewhere that Americans eat 97% more food than they require for good nutrition. It would appear that that sort of condition, while much to be desired, has much the same effect on mortality rates that a significant shortfall of food would have. William C. Paddock, a consultant in tropical agriculture, in a letter to the editor of the Washington Post in May of '74, wrote, "Sooner or later, we must realize that we have already lost the race to balance food production and population growth. We thought we could win it during the last decade. From 1962 to 1972, the United States shipped $14 billion in food aid to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This goodness on our part, justified by bureaucratic assurances that our government would somehow or other pressure these areas to produce more food and fewer children, has in no way minimized the threat of famine at the present time. In other words, the world is less able to cope with a food crisis today than it was before the massive outpouring of food aid. That's because of the ratchet effect I mentioned earlier." In a recent issue of Manus, October 16, 1974, Norman Podritz, the editor of Commentary, is quoted. He wrote, "I believe that issues exist. It is an issue that our society still lives by success conceived in terms of status or money, and that the pursuit of success encourages the development of the worst human qualities and strangles the best. It is an issue that the curiosity of our children wastes away daily in the schools. It is an issue that work provides no satisfaction for the great majority of Americans, whether they sit at machines or behind desks. It is an issue that the air is filled with lies, that public speech has lost all connection with reality. It is an issue that everything we get costs too much money, too much energy, too much spirit. These are not issues that will be raised in any presidential election, but then so much the worse for presidential elections. Intellectuals do raise them from time to time, but in a mechanical way, as though they had trouble remembering what once burned fiercely in their souls, a vision of what a decent human life on this earth might look like, and could only remember their bitterness at the refusal of others to share in the vision. Do intellectuals wish to change the world? Then let them work on the consciousness of the age and forget about parties and movements. Let them attend to their dreams of the good life and the good society," he writes, while others fret about pushing bills through Congress or winning votes in elections. Well, the editors of Manus say that this is an order of conviction which is immediately acceptable at one level of understanding, yet fades and is forgotten when we turn to so-called practical matters. How, after all, does one work on the consciousness of the age? How are changes in goals and objectives induced in human beings? The two ways we have of thinking about a decent human life on this earth are really poles apart, since the inner sense of enjoying meaning and having human fulfillment is not the direct result of effort toward some concrete achievement. It comes rather from a feeling nourished by undefinable existential currents. A change in consciousness is more a change in stance, in elevation and perspective than in activity, although a change in activity often follows naturally from a change in stance. The effects of a change in consciousness are hardly predictable. The man who climbs to a high peak will see the entire landscape quite different in shape from what was visible at some lower altitude. All proportions and relationships alter. Things themselves do not change, but the new perception changes the observer's relation to them, and therefore the value he puts upon them. Explaining this to others who still look at the world in the old way may seem practically impossible. Sometimes we can be impressed by the penetration of those who see the world from another's elevation yet remain unable to have the same perception. Freud once warned his followers that one poet's or philosopher's insight was worth more than a carload of sociologists and their camp followers. But neither he nor anyone else has explained how such insights can be translated into common understanding.